Hi, my name is Dr. Asia Eaton. I'm a psychological scientist and public psychologist, and this is Mindbridge, where science meets human rights. In this podcast, we invite human rights defenders to teach and learn from brain and behavioral scientists about how we can all use science to do human rights work that is more efficient and impactful.
Hello. It's Wednesday, August 27th, 2025, and this is Mindbridge, where science meets human rights. My name is Asia, and today I'm hosting Dustin and Keon to teach us about the science and practice of racial justice. Dr. Keon West is a professor of social psychology with a doctorate from Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar. He is an expert on identity, prejudice, DEI, representation, and body image, and currently works as the head of research at the Runnymede Trust. He's published over 80 empirical papers and is the author of the highly acclaimed book, The Science of Racism: Everything You Need to Know But Probably Don't Know Yet, published in 2025. A truly international academic, he was born in Trinidad, grew up in Jamaica, and studied in the USA and France before finally studying at Oxford and settling in the UK. Welcome, Keon.
Thank you very much, Asia.
Raised in Presque Isle, Maine, Dustin Ward currently resides in New Gloucester with his wife and two boys who have lived in the area since 2015. Dustin holds both a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and a Master's of Divinity. His focus is twofold: being the president and founder of It Is Time, LLC, and a golf entrepreneur, starting Tea Time, LLC in October of 2024. Both businesses look to uplift equity and inclusion in various ways throughout communities in Maine and New England. Most recently, he's been a select board member of New Gloucester, along with being an honorary member and previous implicit bias educator for Mindbridge, and president of the board of Atlantic Black Box. Welcome, Dustin.
A pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Let's go ahead and get started. We have so much to talk about. Dustin, I'll start with you. I'd love to hear about how you got involved in work on racial justice.
Good question, because as I was thinking about this, I really went back and I go, you know what, I've sort of always been in it because I've identified as a multiracial individual. So it's always been cognizant. I've been in this work, but where it really became highly impactful was back in 2020. I was a previous pastor. You heard I had a Master's of Divinity. So I was previously in ministry. And then with the death of George Floyd, I felt a call for many churches, especially the one I was leading at the time, to enter into racial reckoning. And there was so much pushback, so much toxicity that came out of that. I not only moved out of that church, I moved out of the space of ministry entirely and had to grapple with saying, okay, where can I put my talents and skills best? And I said, well, let's put my money where my mouth is, and let's build a business and really focus on bringing this to individuals, not just to the church, but to anybody in New England and other communities. So September 5th, 2020, I built the first business, It Is Time, and started out as a racial equity and reconciliation advocate. And so for me, it's the focus of equity. It's the focus of reconciliation, which is bridging the gap between multiracial groups and the conversations they weren't having and the difficult ones they were. And then I call myself an advocate. I'm no guru, I'm no expert, but an absolute advocate in the work of both racial justice and equity.
Thank you for breaking that down for us. Tell us a little bit more about what a day in the life of It Is Time looks like.
Yeah, it can be fun at times. It can be, you're grappling with a lot of people, but there's never the same thing in any day. There's meetings. Sometimes I'm doing meetings to plan for trainings and workshops. Some days, we go beyond that. We do speaking engagements. Other times we're collaborating and networking. I'm trying to meet people to see how can we move in this space and do things together. And so a lot of great programs or activities have come from my collaborations. But I'm always focused on how do I bring equity, equitable practices, how can we bring change into the spaces that I'm going into for multiracial groups, and how can we improve that quality of life? So it's always going to be slightly different every day, but I'm always conscious of what's the impact. And I always tell a lot of my clients, what's different today than it was tomorrow? What's going to be different months from now than when you started? To me, that journey is so highly valuable and so highly important. So always being cognizant that we're making change and not just staying in the same rut or saying the same conversation over and over.
And Keon, what about you? What does a day in the life for a researcher working on racial justice look like?
I think it's probably worth pointing out that I am not working full time in academia at all anymore, which I did for a while. And research in academia is really about getting to the details of what we know. So we really dig into the minutiae of the theories that we have and exactly how this works and exactly that why that works. And when I shifted into working for the Runnymede Trust, which is the UK's foremost race equality think tank, I discovered how little everyone else cares. So you can't leave a psychology department and start talking about social dominance orientation or social identity theory. Nobody cares. What they want is hard-hitting numbers that affect the general population and affect politicians really quite effectively. And there is a whole other world of research that I think academia could benefit from learning a bit more about that really drills home the what is the practical upshot of this? So you've discovered this thing. Who cares? Whose life is better now that we've discovered this thing? Can you point to it? And it's a very different way to think. And I have to admit, I felt a bit like a newborn baby again, finding my legs because I emerged from this space because it's hard to get to professor. It takes a long time. You feel like you're quite the expert, and then you start again in a new track, and you think, "Oh, goodness, they don't really care how this affects the minutiae of this theory. They think, what are we going to do with this information? And academia sometimes does not prepare you to answer that question very well. So it's been a wonderful new journey.
I've found exactly the same thing in my work with Mindbridge, that people want practical answers for concrete questions, and we have general answers for abstract questions. If I'm supposed to be using hope to persuade people to buy into a human rights issue, how long do I need to communicate about hope for? Or like 30 seconds, a minute? I'm like, God, I don't know. I don't know. But today's podcast and the ones after this are hopefully going to begin to bridge some of that gap. And your book, Keon, The Science of Racism, is also an effort to bridge that gap.
Yes, so I'd say that book was an effort to do something so it's slightly different. It's not the hard hitting. I mean, it is related to the politicians and the general public. It came out of two frustrations. So the first frustration is that the level of general knowledge about racism, to me, is so far behind what the science says that it is essentially trying to tell people that germs exist. So it would be as if the COVID, and I know that's a political thing to say. I'm wading into politics right away, but COVID breaks out, and we don't only have to convince people to wash their hands and wear masks, but we have to tell them that there's such a thing as viruses. That's where we're starting from. That the general public doesn't understand that viruses exist, and that's what it felt like as a professor of social psychology talking to people about racism. They wouldn't know that it was real. They wouldn't have the first clue about what it was or how it worked or what to do about it. And then the second thing that really frustrated me, which I think you know because we've worked together and we've written things together, is that academics often write papers in ways that are needlessly incomprehensible. That we use vocabulary that no one understands, we use statistics that sometimes we don't even understand, and often very simple words and very simple numbers would do, but we don't like that. We are very complicated in the way we say things. And so I thought, I don't know why no one's ever just written this down in simple language before. And I did look, I tried to find it, and there are other things that come close, but I thought, you can explain this sacrificing nothing, keeping all of the knowledge, but explaining it as simply as possible so that people would say, oh, I get it. I get what racism is. Just like they'd say, I get that there are viruses and I need to wash my hands. And that's what I was trying to do.
Dustin, when you do your work, do you find that there's a general lack of awareness? Are you working with communities that have lived experience, so they're, hyper aware of these issues, some of both?
It's some of both, but what Keon's saying is actually the waters I waded in 2020, where it was this general awakening of we had no idea. And it's funny because why people don't know up to this point, why there's this state of, I don't know if it was denial or just a state of we didn't want to engage with it. But 2020, and I don't think we've taken a real, maybe we have, but I don't feel we've taken a real moment to recognize what 2020 did for us in terms of our racial reckoning and that conversation that came out of it, where we collectively stopped and had to bring awareness to something that many of us, as a lived experience, had dealt with our whole lives, and then had to convince people that it was a reality,
Mm.
and then to explain the question that I got proverbially all the time, which was, why are Black and brown people so angry? And it shocked me that we would even ask that question given the many years of history we know of. But I had to basically re educate people the last 2.5 years, bring them to an awareness of why there was anger, why the events of Mr. Floyd and his death sparked what it did. Now, we're still educating, we are still teaching. And so the work that I do is actually always going back to the ground level of the reasons why, the practicality, and then getting people to understand, well, how do I walk out the door with this? And then what do I do with it? But that general level of just unawareness is so palpable. And that's always the entry point into where people, will provide my services. They don't know, so they're bringing someone in. That's where I sort of sit in.
Is that true for your experience with Runnymede as well, Keon?
So Runnymede is run by a racial, the words differ, especially as we jump between countries, but we're all ethnic minorities. There are definitely white people working at Runnymede, but the leadership structure is primarily ethnic minorities. I do not know if that was done on purpose or if that's simply because we happen to be the people with the expertise. But in that space, that does not happen. In Runnymede, everybody knows what racism is and how it works, and they know it in a very political way and a way that focuses on trying to make policy changes. What I did discover, it's another way in which academia is very different from working for policy and think tanks, is that when I started working there, I'd say, why are we doing this? People already know this. So they'd say, this racist thing is happening, and I'd say, but we know this. And in academia, you can't do that. You can't just publish something else that someone else has done. We always want the newest, most groundbreaking knowledge, something that's right on the edge. But actually, I think the situation is similar to the confusion that Dustin, you were describing, where you say, well, why don't people already know this? Hasn't this been known? Hasn't this been said 100 times? And then my boss, the CEO of Runnymede, she says, you have to remind them. If you allow them a moment, they will forget. And it was an interesting and important lesson in the different ways that we do things. And I do think related to that conversation. So Dustin, you said that we didn't realize what a reckoning 2020 was. And I think you're right. I think it was a moment in which we had the microphone and then people were willing to listen. I think what is unfortunate is that they were willing to listen, but the canyon of what they didn't know that they didn't know was so big that they essentially wanted to rush in and they say, well, can't we just plaster this over and be done with it? And said, you can't plaster this. This is 4 centuries. This is a horrifying system that weaves into every area of life that is provably having effects on everything from our health and our mental health and our lifespans and how much money we earn and how much time we can spend with our children and everything that happens in our lives. It's enormous. And so we had the mic. I think we're kind of losing the mic. I think I've seen a lot of people and a lot of companies slightly pull away to say, well, haven't we done this now? And I wish we had somehow done a better job of saying this is not the kind of thing you can fix in an afternoon or even in 4 years. If you don't understand the gravity of what you're dealing with, it's hard to make progress on it.
It's interesting that people, they want an easy fix. They want something short term. Dustin, are you seeing that as well? That it's difficult to get folks to realize how intensive and structural the change is going to have to be.
Yeah, for the first 2 years, I was blessed with the ability to walk people through almost 2 year journeys. I would sign contracts that I would say, hey, we're invested in this. This is a long-term thing. I always would tell people you can't fix this in a workshop. That is not going to be the case. And I was really blessed with some clients I've had that we would start with the introductory workshops, the 5 sessions, and it would lead to a committee. And that committee would then grow. And I'd want to make sure they understood the history, the gravity, the terms, walking them through all that. In the last year or so, you have watched as people have sort of done away with that. We don't get called back in to lead teams, to lead groups. Mostly, hey, I'd love that one quick workshop you did just to remind us all. And it's sad because it loses the flavor of this is a journey. I want to walk with you in it. I'm willing to take the year or 2 years or even longer to move you through and to show you actionable steps. And some people are not ready to be invested. And I think one of the things that I always keep coming back to is what 2020 and 2021 showed us was we can slow down and do the work and take time. But
Hmm.
we rushed back to try to get to 2019. That's what we were doing. We were trying to get back to a pre-COVID ideology and an idea. And that's where we're at now is we just want to rush through. And that has caused us to want to just jump in, do the work, and then move on. And that's unfortunate because you can't do this with such a a burden as racism, such a conversation as diversity, equity, inclusion. So yeah, I'm absolutely seeing that.
Or even that some people succeeded. They got back to 2019, but 2019 was bad. And I think that's
Yeah, yeah. Little did we remember. Yeah.
it's not that this started. I mean, even George Floyd's death is a serious tragedy. It is a horrifying tragedy. But I also get frustrated, and I'm not talking about you, Dustin. I know that you know these things, but often in spaces where people don't know these things, in predominantly white spaces, places where people don't talk about it, they don't know other names. They don't know Mike Brown, which was years
Right.
before. And you don't like this didn't start with George Floyd. It started way before that. It's just some things are caught on camera. That the real tragedy of it isn't just the horrifying way in which George Floyd died, but the many, many people who did not get caught on camera and all the other things that happen every day that we don't get to see, but are still demonstrably true. And the fact that we're not dealing with or addressing those things.
Oftentimes, because you're absolutely right, I remind folks that 2020 is maybe an entry point for a lot of people who never have talked about this, but we cannot forget what many of us had lived through even prior to Michael Brown. There's still Rodney King, there's still Emmett Till, there's right. I explain to people that the history is much longer. I show them a visualization of what they think the world, has been since whatever name we want to end on, but there is so much more. And yes, it takes lifetimes to really develop that gravity, and we should remember those names. But if 2020 is going to be my entry point in, okay, let's at least start there. But you're absolutely right. Like we cannot forget the other individuals who didn't get caught on camera and who we still think of, who we still reckon back to and remind ourselves that they were catalysts for something else, for a new change, and to try to recreate and recapture, what happens when tragedy strikes. And we shouldn't need a tragedy. That's my other issue. Why we need a tragedy to get us to this point is still shocking to me.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right that we should be willing to deal with racism before someone is horrifically murdered. That if that's the only time you intervene, then you're intervening much too late. It's a bit like waiting for a train crash before you will fix the railings. It doesn't make sense. You have to fix them the moment there's slippage. Otherwise, things are going to go horribly wrong.
Yeah.
And I think in that sense, when you say people were in a rush to get back to 2019, some people were. And one could argue that in many ways they've succeeded in that it's right back to the way things were, but now people aren't talking about it anymore. And so they got what they wanted, but that's really not what we should have wanted.
But we have a space now to talk about everyday racism, both subjective experiences and what the scientific data say about instances of everyday racism and how to address them. So let's start there. Keon, your book gives many, many examples of ways that racist discrimination and bias affect people's well-being and life outcomes. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Although, could I ask you, so did you like the book? You've read the book.
I loved the book, and what I love most about it is that it is a education on the scientific process. So the first, I would say, quarter is devoted to helping, intelligent but otherwise naive folks understand what is an experimental design and why should that be something that whose outcomes we trust? What is a meta-analysis? And how does that work? And then I think once people have some of those fundamental concepts under their belts, they can follow the stories that you tell very well.
Thank you. And that means a lot to me because when I've been talking about the book, people say, "Oh, this book is like this other book," and they'll mention a book about racism. So they'll say it's like why I'm no longer talking to white people about race, or it's like me and white supremacy. And I think, yes, but you're missing other books that it's like. And I wanted it to be like Bad Science by Ben Goldacre. I wanted it to be like A Brief History of Time. Even books like The Selfish Gene, although controversial character, I know, but books like that which start out with science. And you would not believe the trouble I had with publishers who said, you want to explain the scientific method? No, that's incredibly boring. Get out of my office. They did not want that. They said, experiments. No, why don't you tell us about the time someone called you the N-word? And I said, there are 1,000 books where someone said someone called them the N-word. We've all read these books. We haven't read a scientific book on racism yet, and that's what I wanted to do. But for that book, you're right. What I did was lay out what the scientific method says. How can we understand racism? And how can we define it? And my definition that I work with, which of course is horrifically simple. So I'm sure, Dustin, when you hear this, all the hairs on the back of your neck will stand up. But it's just any detectable difference in the way you treat people that can only be attributed to race and nothing else. And that is a really hard line, practical thing. And I know we could get into really complicated, almost metaphysical discussions of racism, but I don't care. So when people say, can ethnic minorities be racist? I say, can ethnic minorities show detectable differences in the way they treat people based on nothing but race? Yes, okay, then we can say that it can be racist. And I think that's useful because it gives us something to hang on to, something to measure. And what frustrates me when we talk about race is that we're really willing to have the polite conversation. So everyone agrees that Black women are 4 or 5 times as likely to die in childbirth. Everyone agrees that. We say this every Black History Month. It comes out all the time. And that's true, by the way, both in the US and the UK. It's a statistic that's oddly prevalent. But what we don't agree on is why. Some people think it's because Black women are fundamentally genetically inferior to white women. Some people think it's because they have worse diets. Some people think it's because they don't advocate for themselves or they don't know as much about hospitals or the medical process. The question is it also racism? Are they just treated worse? So if they were to eat exactly the same things and be exactly as healthy on a fundamentally genetic level, if they did everything right, would there still be a difference in how they were treated? And the answer for all of these questions, every time you ask it, is yes. Would Black students do worse than white students in school if they produce exactly the same work? Yes, we know that because we've tested it. Would Black people get worse job offers if they have exactly the same CVs? We know that, yes, because we've tested it. So that's what I call racism, and that's how I show it in the book. And I like to do that because I think it gets us away from that really polite, ooh, well, they're doing kind of worse, but maybe it's because they're less involved or less educated or less naturally gifted. Like, no, it's because you're being racist, and I'd really like it if you stopped.
So by that token, if racism is detectable differences in the way people are treated on the basis just of race, then is racial justice just the elimination of that? Tell me a little bit more about what a racially just society would look like.
So that is actually, I think, a brilliant extrapolation from what I was saying, because people sometimes would ask me, well, what do you want the future to look like? And I'd say, I want to run these experiments one day in the future and find nothing. I want to do the experiment where you get 500 CVs that, are exactly the same as these other 500 CVs, but one set has a white name on them and one set has a Black name on them. I want to send them out into the world and I want to get exactly the same response rates. I want to call a doctor and give them a white name or a Black name or any other name, an Asian name, any kind of name, and get exactly the same wait times and exactly the same offers of treatment and painkillers and everything else that comes out of it, exactly the same prognoses. I want to run every test I can find to see how Black and white people are treated, how every ethnicity of people is treated in any given circumstance, and find nothing. And the day I do that, I'll be completely satisfied. And I think that goal is terrifying in how big it is, but also it is achievable. That is a goal that can happen. We can make that happen. And in many ways, as a society, we understand the steps we have to take to make that happen. And I think giving people that kind of focus shows us how far away we are from the goal of eliminating racism, but also shows us what that would look like if we did.
What about you, Dustin? In your experience, how do you understand and define racial justice on the ground?
I have so many questions for Keon now, but I will answer your question with this concept. I think Keon's doing a really amazing thing in the sense that if you simplify the terminology, if you simplify the logic, maybe that'll get us to a starting point where then we can extrapolate and move forward with the conversation. And so much of my work is to do that. And in this understanding of racial justice, absolutely. I try to simplify it to give people an entry point where we all can enter into. I think if I'm going to define the racial justice piece, I'm looking at the justice piece. Remember, I have a ministry background.
Mm, mm.
And the ministry part of me when we think about justice is to make something whole, because within the religious context, right, we are justified if we are made whole through Christ, is how I used to preach it. So for me, when we're doing justice, it's about making the individual who has been harmed based on racism whole again. Now, there are ways in which we can do that, and one of the ways I invite many of my clients to enter into that is to create the environment and create the space where my identity can fully be immersed in and not be harmed, traumatized, or discriminated against. If that is the case, if that can happen, then you're going to have individuals who will want to be in that space, and then we can enter into racial justice practicalities that move us forward. But often enough, where I think, to Keon's point about, I love your goal. I think if I were to give an answer to that, so much of what human beings have not done is normalized diversity. They have not normalized the very differences. As you're pointing out, Keon, it's any detectable difference. We have not, as human beings, normalized that there may be differences in our world. And being in Mindbridge, many of the things that I'm reminded of as we did our implicit bias is that the human brain, as a survival technique, wants to create boxes and put us in different places as a survival mechanism. We don't normalize differences or diversity because our brains tend to not be wired initially to do that. And so I invite a lot of folks to come to this conclusion that there is a normalcy, there is a reality of which we will all carry these differences, and that should not be a reason to take out our action. So, to what Keon's sort of saying in his definition, and one of my questions somewhere on my notes is, why do we not believe we can do that? Right? I feel like we deny that that truth can happen, that we're so afraid to even enter into that space that we're still wanting to get into boxes and claim different pieces to the point where we segment and segregate one another, and that keeps us safe. And I think my academic question is, well, what's going to trigger us to bridge us to a point where we stop doing that, and we don't need to do that. And some of us are okay with doing that. We're better at it than others. Where's the day and the hour in which all humanity can do that? So it's a long-winded answer, but that's how I'm sort of sitting with this as we're talking about it.
As I listen to your answer, I hear one of the things which, strangely enough, people haven't said as a criticism of the book, so maybe it's not. But the book doesn't deal with something that you haven't said explicitly, but that comes out in some of what you said, which is the idea of reparations or reparative justice. So when I describe my ideal world, I want to run those experiments again, the same ones I ran before. So there's one in which you put police officers in a simulator and you get them to shoot people who are armed and don't shoot people who are unarmed. But sometimes the people are white and sometimes people are black. And the police officers make the mistake of shooting the unarmed black people over and over again and failing to shoot the armed white people. I want to run that experiment till they stop doing that. I want to run it again one day in the future and find, no, there's no difference. They only shoot the people with guns, they ignore the people without guns. And they do that every time, regardless of race. But what it doesn't discuss then is, what do you do about the people who've already been shot, the people who have already suffered and who've already died? And I think your approach does talk more about that. So it does talk more about making people whole and fixing something that's been broken. I think I try to keep the goal as, let's do the experiment with the CVs and get the same job offer rates. Let's do the experiment with the doctors and get the same treatment. Let's do the experiment with the police and get the same rates of being shot. Let's do that. In part because I like to keep people's minds focused on a particular goal and to remind them that this continues to happen now. My worry about talking about the past, and I know we have to talk about the past, but if you start doing that even a little bit, people get this amazing urge to say, ah, yes, racism, the historical things that leave us separated. And I want to say, no, even if there are no historical anything, even if we all started today at the same point, and then we all submitted the same CVs with exactly the same qualifications on them, Black people would still come off worse. That this is not a matter of fixing historical things, it is a matter of fixing things today. So I don't want to ignore the history. I want to hear the importance of the making things whole and the reparative justice. I don't like giving people a chance to get distracted. I want to say, here's a goal. And if you can't do this one, if you are not prepared to say you want a future in which when Black and white people submit the same CVs, they get the same rates of callbacks for jobs, what you're saying is you are fine with a future that is racist, and I'm not. And that's where we're differing.
Dustin, let me ask you, what would you like to see in a 24-hour period over the course of a year in your work to know that we are moving toward or have achieved racial justice? You're not running experiments and getting null results. What's happening for you?
To be completely honest, I feel that the work is still so siloed that we are we are living in an age where I think racism has caused us to fight for scraps and never really get the full benefit of what we are owed and due and what we can achieve. So much of the consulting work, the DEI work, all of it is so siloed because we're so much in a survival mode right now. And for me, there's a desire to see the collaboration and the connectivity of everyone in this space doing this work find some solid ground so that we could move as a movement and not so much as individuals trying to link arms for a minute and then we're back to our own devices. Because it's tough. It's lonely work out here. And the other big thing that I wish we could get to a point of, and we may never get to it, and maybe I have lofty goals. We talk around each other so bad that we end up confusing one another because the language we use is one, moves so fast and never is fully defined. And it's so hard in a world in which language is such a rich piece of who we are. We change words so much and we don't have defined definitions of certain things. Whereas in other things, we define it and that's just how we know it. I think we need to get to a space where we're speaking the same language, even though we come from different vantage points. So if I can have that in my world, I think we would see a lot more coming together than we would separation or segregation. It's just tough. That's a very lofty goal, I know.
But you know what? You're not the only one working toward it. Laura Liguri, our executive director and founder of Mindbridge, talks about human rights as a single unified concept.
Mm.
And that has taken hold in many nations outside of the US. It has not so much in the US because of American exceptionalism and our general tendency to do the right thing at the last minute. And only when our hands are forced. And when you're talking about silos, something I keep thinking about is whether we can achieve racial justice without gender justice, without sexual identity justice, and how intimately these forms of oppression and power are related. I think the idea behind Mindbridge and the idea behind this podcast is really about bringing people who are fighting for social justice together under a shared umbrella, because their causes interrelate and the solutions interrelate.
I agree with that. And I want to be very careful about saying it because I don't want to come across as not being interested in the nuances of sometimes of the struggles that we face. And I think, of course, we should do this. I don't think that there's any true justice if we don't bring everyone along. I think that doesn't work. I do sometimes admire the racist person's capacity for focus in that they never quite exclude other racists because they're not quite racists enough. They just bring all, it's a very broad church to put it in a different way. If you're a racist and someone else is a racist, they pull you right in. They will take Black people who are racist, they will take Indian people who are racist. As long as they're racist against other people, they're happy with that. I think sometimes we who are fighting for good things can be more exclusive, oddly enough, because people fail us in one way or another. And I know that when I say that, what I will get is a lot of people who will get angry at me, asking me exactly what kind of biased people we should take in the church. And I can totally hear that. I hear that completely right. But at the same time, I have sat in rooms of people who have been fighting so much internally that the racists on the outside of the rooms have just been able to chug on with the work that they were trying to get done and to do it really quite effectively. And I think even when I wrote the book, so I started writing it a couple of years ago, I was writing it in a slightly more polite world. I was writing it in a world in which people were ashamed to be racist, at least for the most part in public. I wasn't writing it in a world in which people on both sides of the Atlantic are openly just giving Nazi salutes, are happily saying, yes, I'm racist and it's fine. I think the nature of things has changed to an extent at which we have to identify that we're in a real fight at this point. And I think one side of the fight has known for a long time we're in a fight, and the other side is just about figuring that out. And because of that, we have to be willing to fight back and be willing to pull people in who are willing to fight with us, because it's definitely what they're willing to do.
I'm conscious of the time, and I want to make sure that before we start wrapping up, we offer some concrete solutions to human rights defenders doing this work. Keon, your book talks a lot about the problem, but it also talks about the solution. Can you tell us a couple of things from science that, activists can use in their day-to-day work.
Sure, but what I'd really like to do, if it's okay, is to give two perspectives, I think, on the science of it. Because I think when people ask for solutions to the problem of racism, they generally mean one thing, and I mean another thing. So I think when most people ask, what they mean is, how can I become less racist? And that's a big push for them. In the book, I use a quote from Stokely Carmichael, in which he says, if a white man wants to lynch me, that's his problem. But if he has the power to lynch me, that's mine. And I want to make it clear that what they're trying to solve is very much of their problem, and what I'm trying to solve very much of my problem. So when I hear about interventions, like one of the things that happened in the wake of George Floyd's death was a lot of police officers being put through bias training, which I think is good actually, but I still think that's definitely solving their problems. That's making them less racist. If I had to pick a world in which every police officer loved me, but they could shoot me and get away with it, or a world where they all hated me, but they couldn't touch me, I'd pick the latter. I want a world where they can't touch me, that they can hate me all they want, but I want a world in which I'm safe. And so I want to draw those two different kinds of solutions. One is very much a personal solution based on psychology, and then one is very much an infrastructural solution, which says we have to design a world in which no matter how much racism there is, people are still safe. However much personal racism there is, people are still safe. And I think in terms of the reducing people's racism, there's so many things, like just getting people to interact in a friendly way with each other across the aisles. That's incredibly important. Go spend time in majority, whatever ethnic minority spaces that you have. That's an incredibly important thing. But in terms of making a world in which people are safer, I want structures. Like you can have all your hatred in your bedroom, but when you leave your house, when you go to work, when you go to school, when you operate as a police officer, you have to leave that behind, or society will get you for it. That's the goal I'd have in mind. I'm seeing you nod, Dustin. I don't know what you think about those goals.
I have more questions. Just more questions. There's much you're bringing to the table. I think I'm trying to settle with, do I want to live in a world where hate is still a reality, or am I just living in this facade as a young individual thinking that we can all just get along and link arms? And I think we're at a very particular point in time where 3 years ago I really wanted to just be loved. And I feel more and more like we are at a precipice, and I think you were saying too, where there's a fight coming. And we hate saying it because we are not people who want to pick up arms and fight, because we've lived through and we are endowed with a civil rights movement that got things done because they did not necessarily fight, right? They boycotted, they stood against the system in order to get change. And that's what gave them such endearing love, is that, hey, you didn't fight. So I'm just grappling with sort of hearing, I'd rather the hate, but know I'm safe, versus the love, and yet you can still shoot me. And I guess I'm torn.
I could give you another example that includes more love.
Okay. No,
But
don't do it for my benefit.
no, that's okay. No, I think it's a useful metaphor to explore. So you mentioned you're married, you have two children.
Yes.
So I'm guessing you love your wife loves you, that kind of thing. Would you be happy in a situation in which your wife loved you and she always spent the money fairly, but she had 100% complete total control over all of your finances down to the last penny, and you had none? Or would you rather a situation in which you just also had control of half of the money? And therefore, if your wife stopped loving you for whatever reason, you still had the money. So we can have the love, but if every single spending decision of your life is dependent on her whims, that's still a bad situation, no matter how much she loves you, because we can't live dependent on that. But if you could have a situation in which you also have control, then you could also have love. And it's not one or the other. I just get really nervous about the people who say, no, the solution here, darling, is that I keep all the money, but I just love you so much, so you don't have to worry about it. I'm like, no, if you love me in a more fundamental structural way, you just let me have control over half of the money.
It's like bell hooks, love is an action. Love is an action. Although I want to pick up on what you said about it's not an either or situation. From a scientific standpoint, why not both, right? Or are you just sort of saying, realistically, in today's day and age, because racism isn't going away in our lifetimes in all likelihood, we need to put structures in place that treat people justly?
I'm partly saying that. I'm also partly responding to what I perceive as a hyper focus on one half of the conversation. So that's why I mentioned, in the aftermath of George Floyd, there's, for example, a lot of examples of people getting some kind of bias training to make themselves less biased. And I did some work with companies who wanted themselves to be less biased and say, okay, I'm now a less racist or a less sexist person. And I do commend those efforts. I really do. But I think the missing part, the part that people don't focus on, is putting the structures in place so that in case you're ever replaced by a more racist person, or in case you, for whatever reason, decide to become racist again, that's not the only thing holding things together. That, to return to the other metaphor, I just control half the money. So when your feelings about me change, I can still go out and buy myself something. I don't need to depend on you.
Yeah. In that sense, in the work that I've done, there is a desire to either get rid of or change the system so that, again, the bias training is all great because we're such an individualistic society. We think if I can change the individual, I can change everything. And we fail to change the system. And in that example, especially with police reform, which we had asked for and never really got, you would be trying to change the system and incentivize or put a social umbrella under why you would want to enter in and act a specific way. And there is none of that, right? The bias training is only so good as the system that you end up changing. So in that sense, I absolutely would agree. And I think a lot of the consulting and work that I do, I remind people that it is not just stopping at the bias training for the individual. You've got to change systems. And there's systems that have been put in place that are designed to be racist. And yet if we don't change those systems, we're not really doing anything. We're just trying to, make people either happy or change a heart and mind without really taking any action beyond that. So in that sense, I do agree with that. I think in your example about marriage and love and all this other stuff, when I was in ministry, there was a moment in time I'll never forget where I was someone who preached and taught that I believe women could stand on the pulpit and preach, and there are some who do not believe that. And my wife and I couldn't understand why was the church so against women in ministry. Why couldn't they understand it? And what you just said sort of proved it is that there are some people who actually like to be fully loved and have someone else have all the control. And they want that. And that is where I feel we are currently in this system where I would rather someone else run it all, do all the decisions. And most of those people know that the person in power is going to benefit them. That's the fear, right? I'm okay if someone gives me all the love and you hold all the power if I know that your power dynamic is going to benefit me anyway. And that's where I think racism sheds a light in that power structure doesn't always benefit us. And so you've got to change the system. You have to have system change because those in power actually don't really have our best interests sometimes. They are out to see us as a negative. And you're seeing it happen where even the color of our skin is an automatic bias to take some sort of action. So I just think there are some people who actually like your first version, and those are people that concern me, is because you fall in love with that to the point where you will give up all power, but you're okay with that. And that I'll never really understand, why people can't see beyond that, but people stay stuck in that. They're fine with it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's a really good point. I suppose I'm describing the world as I would prefer it. So if there's a person out there who says, I want my spouse to have full control of the money as long as they love me. If that's where you are, maybe I'm a hyper independent person. Maybe I've learned to be suspicious of systems and powers and
Yeah.
people. But I imagine walking through a world in which every white person loved me to the fullest extent, where I ran all my experiments and it was all null findings every single time. But they could tomorrow, if they wished, just go back to anything, anything. Emmett Till, George Floyd, anything. I don't think I'd ever stop being nervous. And I can see that some people who've grown comfortable in a system, like you said, that always supports them anyway, they wouldn't be nervous because that's what they're used to. I don't think I could ever get past that.
I think the presumption underneath the folks who might feel that way is that love will lead to justice. And we know from the science, unfortunately, that's not true. So we have essentially run out of time, but I want to give each of you the chance to have a last thought, a last comment, a last word, a last question to leave us with.
But I would say that I really value and appreciate the scientific approach that I take with racism, but I also understand it as a limited approach in terms of its dimensionality. So I do describe it as a one-dimensional book at the end of the book when I've written it, that it is a flat book. It doesn't really talk about all the many things that are there. And I think there's a time and place for that. I think that's useful sometimes, because when you have one goal, you know where you're going. That life is simple. If you're a sprinter, you get to the end before everyone else. But life is not a sprint. You can move in more than one direction, and you have to be able to think that way. So I don't want to come off too much as saying this is the only thing we have. I think it's very important that we understand this is what it feels like to win this particular race. But also, it's worth it taking a look around and assessing the many complexities of what we're doing and why. I don't want to lose any of that.
First, I would say I appreciate, Keon, just the way in which you've already made me just reconsider all kinds of things and think in an hour. So I know that the work that you're bringing to this space is just exponentially, I'm sure, is making people churn and really reevaluate where are we going. And I think that's healthy for the work in racial justice. If I were to leave people with, anything, depending on your listener, right? For those who are in this work as well, this is sort of a call to action to say, one, find some rest, because this is very difficult. This is exhausting. I know we've been through this for so long. Find your rest points so that you can pick the work back up, because clearly we have lots to do. If there are listeners who are listening to this who are just curious about, well, what is racism? And maybe this will answer why I'm a racist. I think reading, Keon, your book is amazing. I think it's helpful. I think, but putting a book in front of someone and thinking that that's going to solve the problem is what we're both saying is not the end all be all. So you can't just go out and buy the book and think we're going to end it. There's an action and a practicality to this. So for those listeners who are hoping to get the answers to, what's the book and how's it going to help me? I'm sorry, it's going to be a good book. It's just going to be, you've got to put practicality to it, and you've got to take up the action to it as well. And then I would say I would leave, with both of us. I hope we both can collaborate and move in a future where this is not the only time we interact. Good people like this need to continue to stay in contact. So all three of us, I think, put the responsibility to keep ourselves connected, because this is healthy work we're doing, a healthy conversation.
This won't be the last of us. Dustin, Keon, thank you for your time, your energy, and your work to improve all of human health and well-being.
Thank you for listening. That was Mindbridge, where science meets human rights. To learn more about how we use brain and behavioral science to empower human rights defenders, find us at mindbridgecenter.org and follow us on social media.